The morning mist still clung to the pines when Tom Walker, a weary veteran, set out with his German shepherd, Shadow. Their boots and paws crunched along the forgotten trail, until the dog froze. His ears rose, his body tense, and then, without warning, he pushed through the brush, leading Tom off the path. What could a dog sense in the silence of the mountain, and why, in the shadows of a hidden cave, would Tom discover the dog tag of his closest brother in arms, missing for 2 long years? That discovery would unravel a secret powerful enough to shake an entire town, and to test just how far loyalty, courage, and community can carry us. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your hometown in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The morning in Silver Creek broke cold and blue, the kind of light that seemed scraped raw from ice and sky. Frost clung to the fir needles and turned the ground brittle, every step cracking like glass underfoot. A wind drifted down from the Bitterroot Range, clean and sharp, bringing with it the resin of pine and the faint metallic promise of snow still waiting above the tree line. This was the hour Tom Walker liked best, before the town woke, before engines and voices rose, when it was just him, the dog, and the mountain. Tom was 40 years old, broad-shouldered but lean, 6 feet tall, with the posture of a man who had spent too many years walking lines of flame through timber country. His face bore the weather, creases at the corners of his eyes, a nose long and a little crooked from an old break, and hair once chestnut now carrying streaks of silver at the temples. His jaw was square but softened by 2 days' stubble, the kind of growth that made him look both tired and strong at once. Those who passed him on Silver Creek's main street might have described him as stern, but in truth, he was cautious. 7 years ago, a wildfire had roared out of control, and 2 rookies under his watch never made it home. Tom carried that weight like invisible armor, quiet, constant, dictating his days. He lived alone at the edge of town, in a log cabin he built with his own hands, the solitude broken only by the company of his dog. Shadow padded at his side now, tail sweeping low, paws silent despite his bulk. A German shepherd, 5 years old. Shadow had the kind of coat that shifted with the light, sable running from dark charcoal on his back to a pale amber belly, with a black mask etched over intelligent eyes. His ears stood sharp as arrows, swiveling at every distant rustle, and his gait had the confident roll of a working animal bred to move all day. To Tom, Shadow was more than a dog. He was the anchor that pulled him back each time the memories of flame and screaming radios tried to drag him under. Nights when Tom woke sweating, Shadow would nose his palm until the trembling eased. Days when silence felt too heavy, the dog's amber eyes would remind him, "You are not alone." This morning, they walked a little-used trail that curved up behind the ridge, a maintenance spur no tourist brochures marked. Tom wore his old ranger jacket over a plaid shirt, faded to gray and beige, worn jeans tucked into boots that bore too many scars. He carried a small pack with water, a knife, and a flashlight. Rituals, not just supplies. He let Shadow range a few yards ahead, scanning the slope, sniffing the frozen air, a living barometer more reliable than any weather app. The first hour was pure rhythm, boots crunching frost, breath fogging pale, a raven croaking somewhere overhead. Tom's mind eased into the quiet space he chased every morning, the silence that dulled regret. But peace is fragile. Shadow stopped so abruptly that Tom nearly stumbled into him. The dog's body stiffened, ears angled forward, tail rigid. He gave a low growl that vibrated more in his chest than in the air. Tom froze, every instinct sharpened, hand sliding unconsciously to the knife on his belt. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Shadow didn't glance back. Instead, he broke from the trail, moving with urgency but no panic, weaving into a tangle of salal bushes and wild grapevines clinging to the base of a basalt wall. Tom followed, pushing branches aside, senses heightened. He noticed details now. Moss scraped fresh from stone, a smear of soil out of place, the smell of damp rock seeping through the cold air. 50 yards in, Shadow began to dig at the base of the cliff, where roots knotted thick over stone. His paws moved with purpose, not play. Dirt flew, leaves scattered, and a shiver of colder air leaked through the gap he created. Tom knelt, tugging vines aside, and his stomach tightened. Behind the curtain of roots yawned a shadow darker than night itself. A hole. A cave mouth, narrow but unmistakable. Tom's pulse beat in his throat. He pulled the flashlight from his pack, clicked it on, and sent its beams slicing into the darkness. Stone walls gleamed wet. The smell of ancient water drifted out, damp and musty. Without thinking too long, because thinking too long often killed courage, Tom shouldered his way through. The opening scraped his jacket and swallowed him whole. Shadow slipped in behind him, close enough that Tom felt the brush of fur against his leg. Inside, the cave was no tourist cavern with grand chambers. It was small, no wider than a garage, ceiling low, walls sweating with mineral tears. The silence pressed, broken only by the drip of water and Shadow's paws padding over gravel. Tom swept the flashlight slowly, cataloging the space. Nothing, just stone and silence. For a moment he wondered if the dog had misled him. Then Shadow moved with purpose to the far corner, nose low, whining softly. He pawed at the soil there, gently, carefully. Tom crouched, angling the light. The soil shifted and revealed an edge, straight, metallic. Heart hammering, Tom reached down with gloved fingers and tugged free a thin oval caked with mud. He wiped it against his thigh and froze. Letters gleamed in the beam. Cole Raymond A. The name punched the air from his chest. Ray Cole. Memories came fast, fragments strung like barbed wire. Ray had been a fellow firefighter when Tom was younger, a broad-shouldered kid with a grin that invited trust and eyes that never stopped questioning. He was louder than Tom, quicker with a joke, the kind of man who could find laughter even after a 14-hour shift on the line. After leaving the cruise, Ray had bounced through surveying jobs, land contracts, odd work no one else wanted. He vanished 2 years ago. The word around town was that he'd left for Wyoming, chasing money. Tom had never believed it, and now, here was the proof. His friend's dog tag buried in a cave no one should ever have found. Tom's throat tightened, grief and anger colliding in equal measure. He remembered the last conversation, Ray talking about shady land deals, about people in town who weren't who they pretended to be. Then he had gone quiet. Now, looking at the tag, Tom understood silence wasn't a choice. Shadow pawed again, urging him. Tom dug with his hands and uncovered a waterproof pouch, its plastic grimy but intact. Inside lay a notebook, edges swollen with damp, and a folded parcel map marked in red pencil. He flipped the book open. The handwriting was Ray's, restless, forward-leaning letters racing across the page. Names, dates, land parcels. One name repeating. Mallaloy. Tom stiffened. He remembered Grant Mallaloy, the charismatic man in his 50s, who had stood at a council meeting months ago selling a vision of trails and cabins for heritage tourism. Smooth voice, permanent tan, smile like polished steel. Tom had seen how the ranchers shifted uneasily, how Malloy's words glided too easily past the hard questions. In the notebook, Tom read fragments. Henderson won't sell, pressure, council vote, 2 abstain, trail reroute, cover. One line underlined twice. They won't stop. The cave felt colder now. He slid the notebook back into the pouch, shoved it into his pack, and rubbed a hand down his face. He had found proof that Ray's disappearance wasn't chance. It was something darker. But before Tom could breathe, Shadow stiffened again. The dog pressed close, ears forward, body tense. Voices drifted faint through the trees outside, 2 men talking, their words carried down the slope by the cold air. Tom doused the flashlight, pressed back into the shadows, heart racing. The peace of Silver Creek had shattered. The cave had given up its secret, and nothing would be the same again. Tom's breath came slow and shallow, fogging against the damp cave wall as he crouched in the dark, one hand resting firm on Shadow's tense shoulders. The German shepherd's body was coiled tight, ears pricked, eyes burning amber in the dim. Outside the thin curtain of vines, voices drifted closer, cutting through the morning stillness like a saw blade. Here, a gravel-deep voice asked, the kind that came from too many cigarettes, too much bourbon. The reply was sharper, nasal, quick. Yeah, this is it. Mallaloy doesn't want anyone finding this place. Rip it clean. Tom's chest clenched at the name. Mallaloy. It was no longer just ink in Ray's notebook. It was a command spoken in the flesh, carried by men with shovels and a bag that looked far too heavy for dirt alone. He pressed deeper into the shadows, his free hand pulling the vines inward just enough to conceal the faint beam that still lingered in his flashlight's memory. The two men stepped into view. The larger one was built like a butcher's block, shoulders wide and thick, his neck swelling straight into his jaw. His beard was patchy and uneven, cheeks pitted with old acne scars. The nose sat crooked on his face, a badge from some old fight he had probably won. His eyes were small, dark, and cruel, and they narrowed at the brush as he spat onto the frozen soil. The taller one had a different look, lean, narrow, with the restless energy of a man who trusted nothing. His scalp was shaved down to a gray stubble, the lines of his long face sharp, his lips pressed thin. His pale hands shifted constantly, gripping his shovel, tugging the strap of the canvas bag, fingers twitching as though they needed something to break. His gaze flicked everywhere, never still, scanning shadows as if even the silence might betray him. Tom's instincts screamed to move. He gave Shadow a silent hand signal, down, low, follow. They had practiced it 100 times in forests and meadows. Shadow sank onto his haunches, tail low, eyes locked on Tom's every move. Tom slid sideways into a crevice in the rock, dragging the vines back into place with the slow precision of a man building a fire line, patient, deliberate, leaving nothing that would catch the eye. He placed his boots carefully, choosing patches of stone and frozen roots to blur his trail. Behind him, the men grunted and cursed, pulling at the undergrowth, too busy ripping vines to notice the silence slipping away from them. Step by step, Tom and Shadow withdrew until the sound of branches snapping dulled into the wind. Only when the slope carried them far below the cave did Tom let out the breath he'd been holding. His heart was still hammering, not from fear alone, but from the name. Mallaloy. The same name scrawled in Ray's restless handwriting, underlined twice. The same name now spoken by hired men with shovels. Tom pressed a hand to his pack, feeling the weight of Ray's notebook inside. It was more than paper. It was Ray's voice from the grave, and it had found him. The thought hit hard, a knot of guilt and grief tightening in his chest. He remembered Ray's crooked grin, his booming laugh, the last text message left unanswered. We should talk soon. He had put it off. Now, all that remained was a dog tag and a notebook in his hands. Shadow nosed his palm, grounding him, pulling him back from the spiral. Tom knelt and rubbed the dog's ears, whispering, "Easy, boy. We're still here." They moved downslope carefully, cutting across frozen gullies, always listening. The forest around them was too still, the air too sharp. Tom's senses flicked through every detail. Frost melting into steam, a raven's call distant and flat, the muted sound of water trickling somewhere below. Then he saw it. A line of footprints pressed into the thin crust of ice along the game trail. He crouched, fingers brushing the outline. They were fresh, wide boots, steady stride, angling uphill toward the ridge. Whoever had made them had passed not long ago, maybe less than an hour. Not the men with shovels, their prints were behind him. Someone else, someone with purpose. Every instinct urged Tom to follow. The ranger in him, the man who used to track fire spread across ridges, wanted to map where those boots were heading. But then his hand brushed the notebook again, and the weight of it anchored him. He wasn't free to chase curiosity. Ray's words, Ray's last clues, had to come first. He straightened, jaw set hard. "Not today," he muttered. Shadow tilted his head, then whined softly as if agreeing. By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the morning had shifted. The frost was gone, replaced by wet soil and the tang of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. The town was waking, trucks coughing to life, a dog barking near the mill, the distant clink of dishes in the diner. Tom stayed to the alleys, skirting Main Street. He wasn't ready to be seen. Shadow trotted silently, tail low, head swiveling. They slipped behind the Gazette building, its brick walls weathered, windows half fogged. Tom paused there, crouched in the shadow. He could see through one dusty pane into the small office where Emily Reed often worked. He had only spoken to her twice, once about a burn permit and once when she'd asked pointed questions at a council meeting. She was young, 30, maybe 31, tall and slender, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her dark brown hair, always tied back, framed a face both striking and stubborn. She was Mabel Price's niece, and like her aunt, she had a spine of steel under quiet manners. People in town rolled their eyes at her questions, but Tom had seen how her words unsettled the councilman. She was exactly the kind of person Ray would have trusted with the truth, and exactly the kind of person Mallaloy would silence if he thought she knew too much. Tom's pulse quickened. He imagined walking in, laying, the notebook on her desk, watching those sharp eyes flare with recognition. He imagined her fire, her questions, her determination to drag the truth into the open. But he also imagined the sound of boots outside her office, the crack of glass, the same silence that had swallowed Ray. Shadow pressed against his leg again, sensing his indecision. Tom looked down into those amber eyes and exhaled. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not until I know who I can trust." He turned from the window, pulling his jacket tighter. The name Mallaloy echoed in his head, burning like a brand. Ray hadn't disappeared by choice. He had been erased. And Tom Walker, whether he wanted it or not, was the one holding what was left. The streets of Silver Creek were settling into late morning by the time Tom Walker finally crossed the alley toward the Gazette's narrow brick building. The clouds had thinned into a washed-out gray, light spilling weakly across rooftops patched with moss. The air smelled of wet wood and distant sawdust from the mill. Shadow padded at his heel, his amber eyes scanning every corner, as if he too knew they were stepping into something that could not be undone. Tom's hand brushed the weight in his pack, the notebook, Ray's last words. He had promised himself not to drag anyone else into this, but one name kept circling back: Emily Reed. Inside the Gazette, the space was as cluttered as memory. Desks pushed too close together, stacks of papers leaning like tired soldiers, the smell of ink and coffee clinging to every surface. Behind the main counter sat Emily. She was 30, tall and willowy, with an easy poise that gave her presence beyond her years. Her dark brown hair was tied back loosely, a pencil tucked above one ear, and her face was all sharp angles, softened only by a pair of striking green eyes that caught and held anything they landed on. She wore a navy cardigan, sleeves rolled up, and a simple silver chain that gleamed at her throat. There was steel in her posture, the kind of stubbornness inherited from years of having her questions dismissed by men in council chambers. When Tom entered, she glanced up from her keyboard, expression wary. "Mr. Walker," she said, recognizing him from past council meetings. "I didn't expect to see you here. Trouble with burn permits again?" Her tone was polite but edged with curiosity, a defense she often used when men came bearing half-truths. Tom removed his hat, nodded once. "It's not permits. I need to talk." His voice was low, rough, carrying the gravel of too many quiet years. Shadow sat obediently by the door, but his gaze locked on Emily as if weighing her soul. Emily studied him for a long moment. To her, Tom had always been the reclusive ex-ranger, the man who kept to his cabin and avoided the diner unless necessary. His sudden appearance, with shadows under his eyes and urgency in his stance, pricked her instinct. She leaned back, arms crossed. "All right, talk." Tom hesitated. The last time he trusted someone easily, it ended in ashes. He looked down at Shadow, who nudged his leg once and then, as if making his own decision, padded across the room. The German shepherd stopped beside Emily's chair, pressed his head firmly against her knee. The gesture startled her. Shadow was no ordinary dog. His weight carried a gravity. His eyes seemed to search hers. She reached down almost without thinking, fingers brushing his fur. For the first time, her posture softened. "Your dog seems to think I should listen," she murmured. That was the moment Tom knew to go on. He set his pack on her desk, unzipped it, and pulled out the waterproof pouch. Emily watched as he slid out a dirt-stained dog tag and a notebook swollen with damp, her brows knit together, suspicion flickering. But then her gaze fell on the tag. She froze. Her hand lifted, trembling slightly as she read the name. "Raymond Cole," she whispered. Her voice cracked over the second syllable. Tom nodded slowly. "You knew him?" Emily swallowed, setting the tag gently on the desk as though it might shatter. "He was my Uncle Ray's closest friend. I grew up hearing his name. My Aunt Mabel used to call him Ray with the crooked grin. He disappeared 2 years ago. They told us he'd gone off chasing money in Wyoming, but—" Her eyes lifted sharply, green flames narrowing. "You found this where?" Tom leaned forward, his voice barely more than a growl. "A cave. Shadow led me there. His tag, his notebook, and voices. 2 men. They said Mallaloy doesn't want anyone finding it." The name landed like a stone. Emily's eyes widened and her shoulders stiffened. She pulled the notebook toward her, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was messy, impatient, but unmistakable. She had seen those letters before, on birthday cards and notes left at her aunt's kitchen counter. "This is Ray's hand," she said softly, and the disbelief bled away, replaced by something harder. Resolve. She looked up at Tom, all suspicion gone. "You're telling the truth." Tom allowed a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The knot in his chest loosened, if only slightly. He was no longer alone in carrying Ray's voice. Just then, the office door opened and an older woman stepped in. Mabel Price, Emily's aunt, carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who had weathered storms. She was in her late 60s, her tall frame stooped slightly by time, but her clear gray eyes missed nothing. Her silver hair was tied into a neat bun, and she wore a long wool coat buttoned tight, the faint smell of old paper following her. As Silver Creek's librarian, Mabel was known for her patience, her fierce memory, and her ability to make even rowdy teenagers lower their voices with a single look. "Emily," Mabel said gently, setting a small cloth bag of muffins on the counter. Then her eyes flicked to Tom and narrowed in recognition. "Mr. Walker, you don't often leave your mountain." Emily gestured quickly, her voice low. "Aunt Mabel, you should hear this." She placed the dog tag and notebook on the counter. Mabel leaned forward, her hands steady despite the sudden tension in her eyes. She read the name, touched the page, and sighed heavily. "Raymond," she said softly, grief etching deep lines across her face. "I knew he hadn't just walked away." Tom explained in halting words, the cave, the voices, Mallaloy's name. Mabel listened, her lips pressed into a hard line. When he finished, she looked between him and Emily, her expression grim but unflinching. "Then you'll need more than proof in ink. If Mallaloy is behind this, he's already buried more than one truth. You need to dig where he won't expect it." Emily frowned. "Where?" Mabel's gaze grew distant, remembering. Ray was always scribbling notes, but when he was younger, he kept secrets in places tied to memory. He called them markers, childhood landmarks only he and I knew. An oak tree where your grandfather showed him constellations. A hollowed fence post on the old Beckett farm. If he suspected danger, he might have hidden pieces there. Emily's green eyes brightened with a new fire. "You mean he left a trail?" Mabel nodded. Ray knew Mallaloy's men would burn paper and break bones, but they couldn't erase the past he carried inside him. If you want answers, follow the places that shaped him. Tom felt Shadow press against his leg again, steady and certain. For the first time since the cave, he allowed himself to believe they had a path forward, not just questions. He glanced at Emily, who was already gathering her coat, notebook clutched to her chest like a weapon. She looked at him with something fierce and unspoken. Alliance. Tom nodded once. "Then we follow Ray's markers." The road to Ray's childhood home wound past fields long since gone to weeds, their fences sagging and the barns leaning as if they carried the weight of forgotten years. Tom drove in silence, his old truck rattling on the dirt track, Shadow's head resting between the front seats, amber eyes fixed on the windshield. Emily sat beside him, notebook in her lap, tapping a pen against its spine in restless rhythm. Her green eyes shifted constantly, between the road, the trees, and Tom's lined face. In the rear seat, Mabel Price sat upright, her wool coat buttoned tight despite the heater's warmth, hands folded around her cloth bag as though it held something sacred. She had insisted on coming. This was her nephew's home once, and she knew its corners better than either of them. The house itself stood at the end of the lane, its siding pale and blistered, the roof patched with mismatched shingles, windows filmed with dust. The porch sagged under years of weather. No one had lived here since Ray vanished. The weeds had grown waist-high, and ivy curled over the shutters. It looked like a place trying hard to be forgotten. Tom parked beneath a line of skeletal maples. The cold air hit as soon as he opened the door, carrying the smell of damp earth and wood rot. He scanned the yard automatically, eyes taking in every detail, the tracks in mud, the silence of birds, the faint smell of oil near the drive that did not belong. He tightened his jaw. "Someone's been here." Emily's eyes narrowed, but her voice was steady. "Then, we'd better be fast." She pulled her cardigan closer, clutching her pen like a weapon. Shadow was already pacing the yard, nose to the ground, ears taut, tail low. Mabel moved slower, her gray eyes fixed on the towering elm at the far end of the property. The tree rose crooked but proud, its trunk wide enough to take 3 men with arms spread to circle it. "There," she said softly. Ray loved that tree. When he was a boy, he called it his guardian. If he left something, it would be there. Tom and Emily followed her across the yard, Shadow leading. The earth beneath the elm was soft with years of fallen leaves and rain. Tom pulled the small shovel from his pack and began to dig near the roots, muscles working in silence. Emily crouched to help, her fingers clawing dirt, determination hardening her delicate features. Minutes stretched until Tom's blade scraped metal. He froze, then cleared more soil, pulling free a rusted ammunition box. The hinges squealed as he pried it open. Inside lay papers wrapped in oilcloth, a small external hard drive, and at the very bottom, a cassette recorder. The smell of rust and mildew curled into the cold air. Emily's hands shook as she unwrapped the papers. They were land transfer documents, maps, deeds, some signed under names of locals she knew, but the signatures looked forced, unnatural. "He was recording everything," she whispered. Tom lifted the recorder, fingers brushing the cracked plastic. He clicked it on. Static filled the air, then a voice cut through, smooth, charismatic, unmistakable. "I don't care what he saw. Cole's curiosity ends here. Make it clean, make it quiet. Silver Creek doesn't need heroes. It needs order. Do you understand me?" The voice chilled them. Emily's face went pale. "Mallaloy." Her lips trembled around the name. Mabel's hands gripped the edge of her bag, knuckles white. "God help us," she whispered. "That man's ambition has no bottom." Tom's gut clenched. He remembered the council meetings, Malloy's easy smile, the way people leaned toward him as though pulled by charm alone. Now the mask had slipped, and the truth was a knife. Before they could speak again, Shadow's head snapped up. He growled low, body rigid. A second later, the sound reached Tom's ears, the rumble of an engine rolling up the lane. Tires crunched on gravel, heavy and deliberate. Tom's mind snapped into survival. "We can't stay." He shoved the documents, drive, and recorder back into the box, slammed it shut, and stuffed it into his pack. Emily's eyes were wide, but she nodded, snatching her notebook. Mabel stood straighter than she had in years, resolve replacing fear. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, before bolting toward the tree line. Tom grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her after him, Mabel following close, her steps quicker than her age should have allowed. They dashed across the field, slipping into the forest's embrace just as headlights swung across the yard. From the cover of ferns, Tom looked back. A dark SUV pulled up before the elm, its windows blacked. 2 men stepped out, one tall, one broad. Neither strangers to him now. They carried shovels and scanned the yard with predatory calm. One kicked the earth where Tom had dug, cursing when he found it bare. Emily's breath caught, but Tom pressed a finger to his lips. They waited, hidden in the shadows, as the men prowled the yard like wolves denied prey. Finally, when the sound of their curses faded, Tom turned deeper into the woods, the pack heavy on his shoulders. For the first time, he wasn't just carrying Ray's voice. He carried proof, the kind that could tear Silver Creek open. The night fell heavy and sharp, the kind that pressed cold into bone and made even strong hearts falter. Tom, Emily, Mabel, and Shadow stumbled through the dark pines, guided only by instinct and the faint glow of stars smudged behind cloud. Behind them, the faint hum of an engine and the crunch of boots on leaves haunted the silence. The men had not given up. Malloy's reach was longer than Tom had feared. They pushed deeper until Shadow veered sharply to the left, nose low, tail stiff. He led them toward an old wooden structure half buried in weeds. A hunter's shack or storage shed long abandoned. The roof sagged under moss, the walls gray with age, but it was shelter. Tom eased the warped door open, wincing at the squeal of rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old hay. A broken lantern sat in one corner, and the remains of a bunk still leaned against the wall. They huddled there, pulling shadows close. Mabel sank onto the bunk, her breath shallow but steady, eyes alert despite her age. Emily crouched near Shadow, her green eyes flashing every time a twig snapped outside. Tom stayed by the door, knife in hand, shoulders tense. The danger came soon enough. Voices whispered outside, muffled but near. Boots scraped against stone, moving past the shack, pausing, then circling. One man muttered, "They can't be far." Malloy said, "Check every damn corner." Shadow's muscles locked. His hackles rose, his lips curled silently. Tom pressed his palm against the dog's muzzle, feeling the deep vibration of a bark trapped in his chest. The German shepherd trembled, straining against instinct, but held, eyes fixed on the movement outside. It was the longest hour Tom had lived since the fire line, the sound of danger breathing inches away, the helplessness of silence as their only weapon. Finally, the voices drifted, fading into the trees. Only then did Tom let go, whispering, "Good boy." Shadow slumped against his leg, still quivering, but quiet. At dawn, they emerged, weary and cold. Tom knew Silver Creek was no longer safe. Malloy's grip reached too far. He decided to push them north, over the ridge, to Clearwater County, where an old name came back to him, Nora Collins. Clearwater sat lower in the valley, a place of broad streets and cedar-shaded porches. They reached it by midday, their clothes damp from fog and their faces marked by exhaustion. The sheriff's office was a modest brick building with a single flag snapping in the breeze. A wooden sign read, "Clearwater County Sheriff's Department." Nora Collins emerged before they even knocked. She was in her early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that filled a doorway. Her hair was dark auburn, tied back in a no-nonsense braid, and her skin was sun-browned from years spent in the open. A faint scar cut across her left eyebrow, the remnant of a bar fight when she was a deputy. Her eyes were a clear steel gray, measuring, steady, not easily fooled. She wore her uniform crisp, the badge polished, a revolver at her hip. But it was the set of her jaw that marked her as different, firm but not cruel, decisive but not arrogant. "Walker," she said, recognizing him with a curt nod. "Heard you'd gone into hiding. What brings you out now?" Tom opened his pack, drew out the recorder. He clicked it on, letting Malloy's voice bleed into the open air. Nora's eyes darkened as she listened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. When the tape ended, the silence was sharp enough to cut. Emily stepped forward, her voice tight. "That's enough to arrest him, isn't it?" Nora shook her head slowly, her braids swaying. "Not like this. A man like Malloy's covered his tracks. If I drag him in behind closed doors, his lawyers will tear it apart. His friends on the council will bury it. And worse, half the town will never know why he walks free again. That's how men like him win." She fixed Tom with a stare, her voice steady as stone. "We need more than an arrest. We need truth too big to hide. We need the whole town to hear what he's done." Mabel's tired eyes lifted, soft but resolute. "Ray tried to warn us quietly. That got him killed. Maybe you're right. Maybe only the light can burn out men like Malloy." Tom's gut twisted. He was not a man who sought crowds or speeches. He was built for quiet trails and battles fought in silence. But he looked at Emily, her green eyes blazing despite the fear in her hands. He looked at Mabel, whose grief had sharpened into courage. He looked down at Shadow, whose loyalty had dragged him into this fight, whether he wanted it or not. And he knew Nora was right. The truth had to be louder than Malloy's lies. The air in Clearwater carried the crisp bite of early autumn, the kind of chill that sharpened the colors of the leaves and made the air feel thin and electric. That morning, the streets were alive with the bustle of the Harvest Festival. Booths lined Main Street, piled with pumpkins, jars of honey, quilts, and roasted corn on the cob. Children darted about with painted faces, chasing each other between hay bales, while fiddles and banjos filled the square with music. To any outsider, it looked like the picture of small-town peace. But beneath the warmth of cider and laughter, a current of tension ran silent. Tom Walker felt it in the pit of his stomach. Shadow, walking at his side, felt it too. The dog's ears were pricked, his body taut with alertness. Malloy was there, as expected. He stood tall on the makeshift stage erected in front of the courthouse. wearing a charcoal suit that seemed too polished for the setting, his tie the color of blood-red apples. His hair was thick and combed back with a sheen that caught the stage lights, his sharp chin and square jaw carrying the smug expression of a man who believed himself untouchable. His voice rolled easily into the microphone as he spoke about prosperity and growth, words that flowed like oil, smooth but cloying. The crowd clapped politely, though Tom noticed a few pairs of eyes that seemed tired of the same speech, the same promises. Sheriff Nora Collins stood at the edge of the square, blending into the crowd but commanding the space around her with quiet authority. Her uniform pressed and boots polished, she looked like a sentinel among farmers and townsfolk. Close by, Emily Reed clutched her notepad, every muscle tense with anticipation. The green of her eyes was bright even under the overcast sky, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her role today was not to write, but to witness, to see the truth delivered in the open. Beside her, Mabel, frail but unyielding, carried a folded quilt across her arms, its fabric heavy with years of work and memory. The plan had been set in motion the night before. Deputy Evans, Nora's trusted second-in-command, was in her early 30s, with chestnut hair cropped short under her cap and a sharp, quick-witted face. A former IT technician before joining law enforcement, she was adept with systems and had volunteered to hijack the festival's projection feed. While Mallaloy basked in the glow of his own self-importance, Evans was at the control tent, fingers flying across her laptop, nerves held in check by her steady training. "And with your faith in me," Mallaloy declared, spreading his arms like a preacher, "this town will know a harvest like never before. Together, we rise into—" His words stopped abruptly. The giant screens flanking the stage flickered, his smiling face replaced with static. A heartbeat later, the sound of his own voice filled the square, colder than any autumn wind. "He knows too much." The recording played, clear and undeniable. "The soldier boy Beckett's a liability. Take care of it, permanently." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the gasps. Faces turned, eyes widened, hands flew to mouths. Parents clutched their children close, elderly men shook their heads in disbelief, and whispers rippled like wildfire through the crowd. The truth had landed. Malloy's composure cracked, his confident smirk faltered, his jaw twitched, and sweat glistened at his temples despite the cool air. He raised his hands as if to calm them. This is doctored. Lies, slander. Don't be fooled." But his words rang hollow now, like a preacher caught in his own sin. At the back of the crowd, Tom's eyes flicked sharply. One of Malloy's enforcers, a man known only as Briggs, began pushing his way through the throng. Briggs was a hulking brute with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his left cheek, his bulk wrapped in a black leather jacket. His cold blue eyes darted, panicked, seeking escape. Tom crouched, his voice low but commanding. "Find!" Shadow exploded into motion, a gray and black streak of muscle and instinct. He tore through the maze of legs, weaving effortlessly until he closed in on Briggs. The enforcer had just reached the narrow alleyway when Shadow launched, his teeth clamping down on Briggs's arm with a grip like iron. The man bellowed, thrashing, but the shepherd held fast, dragging him to the ground. The crowd surged, cries of shock turning into cheers as deputies rushed to seize him, locking cold cuffs onto his wrists. Back at the stage, Nora Collins stepped forward, every inch the law in her pressed uniform. The roar of the people gave her words the weight of thunder. She mounted the steps slowly, deliberately, until she stood beside Mallaloy. The sheriff's gray eyes bored into his, unflinching. "Marcus Mallaloy," she said, her voice clear enough to cut through the chaos. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and for ordering the murder of Raymond Cole." The square erupted in shouts of agreement, voices raised in fury and vindication. Before Mallaloy could even muster protest, deputies closed around him. The handcuffs clicked, echoing louder than the fiddle music that had started the day. For the first time, Marcus Mallaloy looked small, his shoulders sagging, his eyes wild, as the people he had ruled with fear now stared at him with nothing but loathing. At that moment, Mabel and several of her friends from the church unfurled the quilt she had carried. It stretched wide, its colorful squares hand-stitched with the names of families Mallaloy had dispossessed, names now shining in the sunlight, like a ledger of justice. Murmurs rose into cries, cries into chants, until the whole town square thundered with unity. The quilt became a banner, a living testimony that the community had not forgotten and would no longer be silent. Emily stood close to Tom, her hands trembling as she scribbled every detail into her notebook. But more than her notes, it was her eyes that glowed with fire, the eyes of a woman who knew this moment was history. She whispered, "Ray didn't die for nothing. He's here in every name, every voice." Tom looked at her, then at Mabel, then down at Shadow, who sat panting proudly, his amber eyes gleaming with purpose. For the first time in years, Tom felt the crushing weight of solitude lift from his chest. He was not alone. They all carried Ray forward now. The festival, once meant to celebrate harvest, had become the town's reckoning. And for the first time in decades, the soil of Silver Creek felt ready to grow something clean again. Snow had returned to Silver Creek, blanketing the valley in silence. The mountains wore crowns of white, and the pines along the ridgeline bent under the weight of fresh drifts. Smoke rose in thin blue ribbons from the chimneys of homes that had stood through hardship, and now seemed to breathe easier. It had been 3 months since the Harvest Festival, and the trial that followed had stripped Marcus Mallaloy of the power he once wielded like a whip. Found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Raymond Cole, he now awaited a long sentence in a state penitentiary, his name a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had once feared him. The land he had stolen through lies and intimidation was returned to the rightful families. Farms that had lain fallow began to stir again, their fields dark and fertile under the snow. There was a feeling in Silver Creek that the soil itself was beginning to forgive, to heal, as though it too had long carried the weight of Malloy's greed. The town's library, once dusty and ignored, had been renovated with the help of volunteers. Fresh paint covered the walls, shelves were stocked with donated books, and in the main hall hung a centerpiece, Mabel's quilt. The quilt of names, stitched square by square, bore the memory of families wronged and the proof that a community could rise again. Hung beneath warm lighting, it glowed with meaning far deeper than fabric. It was a ledger of resilience. Visitors stopped in silence before it, tracing the embroidered names with reverent fingers, some with tears in their eyes. Emily Reed moved briskly through the library's entrance one cold morning, her long wool coat brushing against her knees, her dark hair tucked under a knitted cap. She had grown into her new role as editor-in-chief of the Silver Creek Gazette. Still young, her face bore the determination of one who had fought for truth and paid in sleepless nights. Her green eyes, once uncertain, now held steady fire. She had already begun using her platform to shine light on the town's future, covering stories of reclaimed farms, new businesses, and children's programs, all part of ensuring no shadow like Malloy's would ever take root again. Mabel, thinner now but spry, walked with a cane carved by her late husband decades before. Her silver hair was always neatly combed, her glasses perched at the edge of her nose. Age had not dimmed her mind. She had become the quiet leader of a group of seniors who gathered weekly in the library's back room. They planned charity drives, stitched blankets for the needy, and, perhaps most importantly, reminded the young of what resilience truly meant. Mabel's voice, though soft, carried the weight of decades, and she was listened to with respect. Tom Walker had changed in those 3 months as well. Once a solitary figure haunted by memory, he had joined the county rescue team. His lean frame, his broad shoulders, and his endurance honed from years in the forest made him a natural fit. Though he still wore the lines of grief on his face, they had softened, replaced by a purpose that steadied him. His hair, streaked with silver, caught the pale winter light as he trained younger recruits. Many in town, who had once only whispered about him, now greeted him with nods of gratitude. Shadow was perhaps the most beloved resident of Silver Creek. The 5-year-old German shepherd still carried his proud frame, his slate gray and white coat thick in winter, his amber eyes always watchful. By day he lay on the library steps, a silent guardian, letting children pat his head as they passed with mittens and books. At night, he curled by the fireplace in Tom's cabin, the steady heartbeat that reminded Tom he was never truly alone. The dog's loyalty, once the thread that pulled Tom back from the brink, was now shared with the whole town. To the children, he was a friend. To the old, a reminder that courage sometimes comes on 4 legs. One afternoon, the townsfolk gathered in the square, despite the cold. Snowflakes danced on the wind, catching in scarves and beards, as the new plaque was unveiled in front of the courthouse. Sheriff Nora Collins, uniform crisp beneath a heavy coat, stood tall beside it. Her scarred eyebrow gave her face a stern cast, but her eyes were softer now, less weighed down. The plaque read simply, "In memory of Raymond Cole, soldier, brother, friend. May truth always stand in the light." Nora's voice carried over the hush, steady as always. "This town will never again bow to shadows, not while we stand together." Applause rose, echoing against the snow-covered storefronts. Emily scribbled notes, though her eyes glistened. Mabel dabbed her cheeks with a handkerchief. Tom laid a hand on Shadow's head, whispering low, "Ray, we brought it home." The days that followed were gentler. Children ran in the snow outside the library, their laughter spilling into the quiet streets. The old farmers who had regained their land planned spring planting with renewed hope. Quilting circles filled the evenings with soft chatter and the rhythm of needles through cloth. Silver Creek had been scarred, but now it was healing. And in the quiet heart of winter, with smoke curling from chimneys and a quilt hanging in the library, the town finally breathed in peace. In the end, the story of Tom Walker, Shadow, Emily, Mabel, and the people of Silver Creek was never just about exposing Marcus Malloy's corruption. It was about proving that even in the darkest valleys, truth can find its way into the light when ordinary people choose courage over silence. A quilt stitched with names became more than fabric. It became a banner of hope. A dog's loyalty became more than instinct. It became the spark that pulled a town back to life. And a man who thought he had nothing left discovered that community, faith, and love could restore him. Perhaps this is how God works in our lives, not always in fire and thunder, but through small mercies, the strength of a neighbor, the honesty of a young reporter, the comfort of a faithful friend at our side. Miracles are not distant. They are in the everyday acts of loyalty, forgiveness, and kindness that bind us together. So, tonight let this story remind you, you are not alone. Stand firm in faith, love deeply, and give even when it costs you something. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and joy. Please share this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of courage, redemption, and second chances.